At the start of this series, we said something that mattered more than it seemed to at the time. Arabia was not isolated. We meant it about trade routes, about rival empires, about a Red Sea that connected more than it divided. We did not yet mean it about a single family fleeing for their lives, with nowhere in Arabia left safe to go. This episode is where that first claim becomes personal. For nearly 100 years after Caleb's crossing, after Abraha's church and his elephant and his failed campaign, Aksum's own story goes quiet. Its inscriptions thin out. Its kings become names without detail. Historians sometimes call this stretch an Aksumite dark age, and it is an honest name for it. We do not know as much about this period as we would like. But into that quiet, a new story arrives, not from Aksum's own records. From Makkah. By this point in Makkah, a small community had gathered around a message that unsettled the city's most powerful families. It was not a large community. It was not a wealthy one. Many of its members were poor, enslaved, or without powerful protectors of their own. And Quraysh had noticed them. What began as mockery hardened into something worse. Beatings, boycotts, torture in cases where a person had no clan left willing to shield them. There is a particular kind of danger in being a small minority inside a hostile majority with nowhere else in your own land to turn. Makkah had no rival power strong enough to check Quraysh's authority. Every direction in Arabia led back to people who either agreed with the persecution or were too weak to stop it. Except one direction. Across the sea, to a kingdom none of them had seen with their own eyes, ruled by a king known only by reputation. This was not a random choice, and it is worth pausing on why. Aksum was known, even from a distance, as a place where a Christian king ruled with fairness. Islamic tradition describes it plainly, a land where, in its own words, no one is wronged. There was history behind that reputation too, even if the people making this decision in Makkah were not thinking of it in these terms. This was the same kingdom that had crossed the Red Sea a century earlier to answer what happened at Najran. A kingdom that had, at least once before, acted because injustice elsewhere mattered to it. The prophet himself is reported to have told his followers this directly. Go to Abyssinia. There is a king there who wrongs no one. Stay in his land until God grants you relief. So they went, not as conquerors, not as merchants, as people asking a stranger for mercy. The first group was small. Some accounts count 11 men and 4 women. Others give slightly different numbers. What the sources agree on is the scale. This was not a mass exodus. It was a handful of people willing to leave everything behind rather than abandon what they believed. Among them was Uthman ibn Affan and his wife Ruqayya, the prophet's own daughter. They crossed the same narrow sea Caleb's fleet had crossed generations before, though this time carrying nothing that resembled an army. They reached Aksum, and they were not turned away. For a while that was the whole story, a small group given shelter left largely alone. It would not stay that simple. As persecution in Makkah worsened, a second wave followed, and this one was different in scale entirely. Accounts describe somewhere between 80 and 100 people this time, men, women, children, an entire fragile community relocating itself rather than a handful of individuals slipping away quietly. At its head walked Ja'far ibn Abi Talib, the Prophet's own cousin and the brother of Ali. This was no longer something Quraysh could ignore. A growing community, safely settled under the protection of a foreign king, was not a problem that would simply fade with distance. If anything, it was worse than the community staying in Makkah. It meant they had found somewhere permanent to be, somewhere Quraysh's authority did not reach. So Quraysh decided to reach across the sea anyway. Quraysh sent 2 envoys to the Negus's court. Amr ibn al-As, a sharp and capable diplomat who would, years later, become a Muslim himself, and Abdullah ibn Abi Rabi'a alongside him. They came with gifts, carefully chosen. Leather goods, valuable and well-made, the kind of tribute meant to open doors before a single word was spoken. Their pitch to the Negus was simple, and it was designed to sound reasonable. These people have abandoned their own community's religion. They have not joined yours either. They follow something new, something neither of us recognizes. Hand them back to their own people where this matter belongs. It was a good argument, built to work on exactly the kind of ruler who prefers not to involve himself in a foreign community's internal religious dispute. The Negus did not simply hand them over. He did something Quraysh had not planned for. He asked to hear the refugees speak for themselves first. Jafar stood before the Negus and did not waste the moment. He described what their lives had looked like before, a people, in his words, plunged into deep ignorance, worshipping idols, eating what should not be eaten, severing family ties, neglecting the basic duty of hospitality to a stranger, living, in short, by the law of whoever was strongest. Then he described what had changed. A man had risen among them, from their own lineage, known even by his enemies for his honesty and his integrity. This man called them to a single God, asked them to abandon the idols their own fathers had worshipped, and asked them to treat one another and strangers with a decency their old way of life had never required of them. It is worth sitting with how direct this was. Jafar was not asking for pity. He was explaining plainly what this new faith actually demanded of its followers and letting the Negus judge that description on its own terms. The Negus listened, but Quraysh's envoys were not finished. Realizing the first attempt had failed, Amr ibn al-As tried something sharper. He told the Negus that these people held a monstrous view of Jesus, hoping that a Christian king would recoil from whatever he heard next and expel the refugees himself, without Quraysh needing to ask twice. The Negus turned to Jafar and asked him directly, "What do you say about Jesus, son of Mary?" Jafar answered without hesitation, "We say of him what our prophet has brought us. He is the servant of God, his messenger, his spirit, and his word, breathed into Mary the Virgin." The Negus reached down, picked up a small stick from the ground, and held it up. "By God," he said, "Jesus, son of Mary, does not exceed what you have just said, by so much as the length of this stick." His own bishops were furious. This was not the answer they expected a Christian king to accept so readily. The Negus did not care. He returned Quraysh's gifts. He told their envoys to leave his court, and he granted the refugees something stronger than shelter. He granted them his protection permanently for as long as they wished to remain. The refugees' safety, it turned out, was tied to one man's grip on his own throne, and that grip was not unshakable. At some point during their stay, a rival rose against the Negus, a real challenge to his rule, serious enough that the two men met with their forces at the banks of the Nile to settle it directly. The Muslim refugees were terrified, and their fear made complete sense. Everything they had, safety, shelter, the freedom to practice their faith openly, existed because of one specific king's goodwill. If he fell, none of that was guaranteed to survive him. One of their own, a young man named Zubair ibn al-Awwam, took it on himself to find out what was happening. He inflated a water skin, used it to swim across the Nile itself, and watched the battle from close enough to see its outcome. Then he swam back, and he told them the words they had been waiting to hear. God has given the Negus victory and destroyed his enemy. Islamic tradition holds that the Negus, privately, came to believe in the message these refugees carried, even while continuing to rule a Christian kingdom outwardly. We should be honest about the shape of that claim. It rests on Islamic sources describing his private conviction, not on any surviving declaration from Aksum's own side confirming it. Whatever passed in that king's own heart is not something history can fully verify from the outside, for him or for anyone. What we can verify is what happened after his death, and it tells us plainly how the prophet himself regarded this man. When the Negus died, word reached Medina the very same day, faster than any ordinary messenger could plausibly have carried it. The prophet gathered his companions. Today, he told them, a righteous man has died. Stand and pray for your brother. He led them to open ground, lined them in rows, though there was no body present, nothing physically there at all, and prayed the funeral prayer for a king across the sea, exactly as he would have prayed it standing over a grave in Medina itself. This single act became something larger than a moment of grief. It became law. Salat al-Ghaib, the funeral prayer offered for someone who has died elsewhere, traces directly back to this specific afternoon. Islamic scholars would spend centuries afterward debating exactly how far this practice should extend to others, but its origin was never in dispute. It began here with this specific king, prayed for by name, by a prophet who considered him worth mourning properly, whatever the distance between them. The refugees eventually went home. Some returned early after a false rumor reached them that Quraysh had softened. The rest stayed until the 7th year after the Hijrah, when the prophet sent for them directly. They arrived by 2 ships and reached him while he was at Khaybar. When he saw Ja'far among them, he embraced him and said something that has been remembered ever since. I do not know which makes me happier, the conquest of Khaybar or the arrival of Ja'far. That reunion closes the human story cleanly. But Aksum's own story did not end there, and it deserves its own honest close too, since this kingdom carried this whole series from its very first episode. In the generations after this, 3 things converged on Aksum at once. A plague, one contemporary writers in Byzantium and Syria specifically traced back to Ethiopia itself, moved through the population for the better part of 2 centuries. The land itself began failing. Increasing aridity, worsening soil erosion from centuries of farming and cutting wood for fuel, slowly stripped away the agricultural base a kingdom this size depended on. And then, in the year 642, Egypt fell to Islamic conquest, severing Aksum's old trade link to the Mediterranean world entirely. Its coinage, once meaningful from the Red Sea to Byzantium, became worthless outside its own shrinking borders. The kingdom did not fall in a single dramatic collapse. It simply withdrew, generation by generation, into its own highlands, until the wider world that once knew it as a great power barely remembered it was there at all. 4 episodes ago, we opened with a claim. Arabia was not isolated. We showed you a trade rivalry with Kush, a conversion to Christianity that reshaped a kingdom's identity, a massacre at Najran that pulled in Byzantium and split a Christian alliance across its own unresolved theological divide, a church built to rival Makkah itself, and an elephant that would not rise. And now, a family fleeing persecution, finding safety not among their own people, but across a sea in a kingdom built by strangers who did not share their faith, yet chose to protect them anyway. None of this was inevitable. None of it was simple. Kush could have stayed Africa's dominant power. Byzantium and Aksum could have let their doctrinal split outweigh their shared urgency at Najran. Abraha's elephant could have risen. The Negus could have handed the refugees back without a second thought. At every one of these points, the story could have gone differently, and it did not. Aksum crossed a sea once for people it had never met, because word reached it that they were being wronged. Generations later, it did the same thing again for a different people entirely, asking for the same thing, somewhere safe to stand. That is not a small story, and it was never only Aksum's story to tell. It is why, when we said Arabia was not isolated, we meant every part of it.